Welcome to the Garden Glow Up podcast. Today I'm here with Dr. Lanette Sobel, and we're going to be talking about compost. Hello. Lanette, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your company and how you got into composting?
Sure. So I'm the founder of Fertile Earth Worm Farm. We are the only composting entity in South Florida that's focused on commercial, and we are also by far the largest. We've been around for 16 years, so we're like the OGs for composting in South Florida. And we service commercial establishments in Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach counties, and we are currently in the process of expanding to Monroe County and also Central Florida and like some areas in North Florida. And what we do is we work with entities like the Miami Marlins. They were actually our first client. Miami Heat, Whole Foods Market. We do some Chipotle's and some Starbucks, some food distributors, a bunch of hospitals, things like that. So anybody who produces large amounts of food scraps, we are able to work with them, collect it, and then we turn it into soil. So either compost, worm castings, or worm tea, which I'm sure we can get into a little later.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think you also teach classes, right?
I have in the past, and we're going to be starting up workshops like in the near future.
Oh, awesome. At the farm?
Yeah, most likely at the farm or at our partner's farm. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. Okay, so what is compost and why should it matter to an average home gardener?
So compost really is the act of recycling organic matter back into soil, like in the easiest sense of the definition, the word, right? And it's just what nature does. Everything's a cycle in nature. There's no such thing as waste in nature. Waste in one cycle is a resource in another. So when we're done with eating that apple and we are left with that apple core, what happens to it? Like in nature, it turns into soil, and then that soil helps grow another apple tree potentially, or something else. So it's this continuous cycle that unfortunately us humans have broken by having this linear system of take, make, and waste. It's this linear system that we take resources from the environment, make things with it, and then we throw in the landfill. And the reason why I got into this was I actually learned how landfills worked, which is not something that like we get taught in school. And
no, and even as a home gardener that cares, as much as I compost, I actually know nothing about why it's different than putting your waste in a landfill.
Yeah, so I think that's really important to understand, because I think once most people understand what actually happens when we throw things in landfill, they'll think about it twice, because there's no such thing as away. We don't throw anything away, So when we put food in the landfill, it's actually a ticking time bomb for future generations, because what ends up happening is the way landfills are built is that everything in that garbage truck goes up to the landfill, they dump it, and then it gets covered with something. So it could be mulch, it could be fill dirt, and they're doing that to block out the air and also the moisture. So it becomes this anaerobic environment, so without oxygen. And when you're decomposing things in an anaerobic environment, you generate methane gas. And methane gas, depending on who you talk to, is 80 plus times worse as a greenhouse gas emission than carbon dioxide.
Yes.
So we've recently, it's just recently been getting like much more attention, how detrimental it is to the environment to landfill. I think earlier this year, NASA released a study where they're actually able to visually see methane gas emissions. And the methane gas emissions coming from landfills is much worse than we previously thought. And before then, the EPA had said that if landfills were to be a country, it would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions behind China and the United States. So it's a huge issue in terms of climate change. And so not only that, what ends up is when you put your juicy organics into the landfill, that's really the only moisture that goes into the landfill, because like I said, they're blocking out the moisture with the spilled dirt.
Mm-hmm.
And that ends up trickling down through the landfill, picking up heavy metals and toxins, and becomes a toxic soup called leachate. And we don't really know what to do with leachate. Leachate is similar to spent uranium rods. So when I got into this, I was working with a professor that was a wastewater expert, and he had a bunch of studies on how to remediate leachate, and we don't have a solution for it. So in a modern landfill, we have a plastic liner that keeps everything that's supposed to be in the landfill inside and doesn't let anything leak. But in reality, those plastic liners have a lifespan about 50 years. So they'll end up breaking down, and this toxic leachate can decimate our aquifer. So our drinking water is at risk.
Right.
So in modern landfills, they'll pump out the leachate, but it's in a holding tank, and we don't have a solution for it. So just by avoiding putting food into a landfill, we actually dramatically reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, because that's what's decomposing. The aluminum can isn't decomposing, but the food is, albeit very, very slowly. There was actually a study done, I don't know, many years ago, where they dug 50 years down into a landfill, and they actually found a hot dog and the bun completely intact. So that's how slowly things can decompose in the landfill. And yeah, like the only mountains we have in Florida, South Florida at least, are landfills. And you go by there and you smell that very distinct smell. That's the methane.
Okay.
And there's some landfills that burn the methanes and they convert it to carbon dioxide, and a lot of them don't. So food just doesn't belong in a landfill. Food belongs on the earth. And if you want a prosperous garden, you really want this compost, because that's the organic fraction of soil is the compost. And especially here in South Florida, we don't really have soil. Like if you dig down the earth, like you hit rock, right? Like we're on coral rock for the most part.
Yeah.
And my farm is actually one of the few places that actually has real soil, because a river used to run through it.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So we have feet and feet of this marl soil, which is this clay, really amazing soil, but that's not common. That's super rare. Like most of Florida is on coral rock, and so we import a lot of soil, or we import soil products all over from all over the world, So why not make it?
Exactly. That I do have a corner in my backyard where I compost. So and it's relatively easy to do. But one thing I want to differ, you said something and I want to get where you stand on this. I compost kitchen scraps, so the way compost I think is usually sold to the layman is you use things that are uncooked and that come from a garden to go in compost. So we're talking about the stems of your broccoli, coffee, things that weren't once alive, like an animal, but you did mention food. In your mind, where does a hot dog belong in a composting system? Because I know some people do it, but so let me elaborate. The reason people usually are told not to do it is to not attract pests. So even if you want to compost, if it's just old lettuce, you're not going to get rats or foxes or raccoons coming to your garden specifically for that. You would have to put some meat in there. So even though I think that's a good rule of thumb for home gardeners, since you're doing it on a commercial scale, I'm wondering where you land on should we be doing this with food or not?
I think we should compost everything. That's my personal opinion. And we all turn back to stardust. Everything turned back to stardust. I turn back to stardust. You turn back to stardust. Everything turned back to stardust. I want to be composted when I die. I want to be in a mushroom suit and plant a mango on top of me. So so you're absolutely right though. It's really interesting that most people think that oh no, you can't compost meat, and that we have to put it in a bag and put it in the trash can. And that's absolutely not true. Meat is actually a great component of a compost system. So the bones are really, really high in phosphorus. The blood is super high in nitrogen. So there's so many nutrients that are more prevalent in meat, animal products, that it makes for a really good compost, because I can't create minerals. I can't create zinc, cobalt, manganese, phosphorus. I can't. Like, it has to be in the feedstocks. So it has
Okay.
to be in like the feedstocks that I use to compost in order to end up in the compost. You know,
Mhm.
I'm not inventing anything. So if I
Right.
don't have like the phosphorus to begin with, like my compost is not going to have the phosphorus. So I'm a huge believer in compost everything, like compost everything, and your compost is going to be like hella better for it. And but what you do need to keep in mind though is exactly what you said, that you do have a higher chance of attracting unwanted pests. So definitely, you know, vermin. So you have to do it right.
Right. So what does doing it right look like?
Doing it right, like simply, is just never having food exposed.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So if you have like a compost pile, like you definitely don't want any. This goes for non-animal products too. You don't want food exposed. So flies,
So
they can
so
also.
let's say you like buried it in the ground. That would be how you would compost. Like I've seen people bury chickens. They'll be like, "Okay, my chicken passed away. And they'll
Yeah,
bury it in the ground. And now that you're mentioning it, I'm like, "Oh, I guess nothing would find it if you just buried it."
yeah. You know, that's how humans bury bodies too. You know, it's like, yeah, exactly. Like covering it in something. So when you compost it, cover it in mulch. Mulch is actually a biofilter. Mulch is my best friend. It's
Okay.
probably any composter's best friend. Mulch is amazing because flies, they can't burrow, they can only land. So if you cover the food, you're not going to have an issue with flies. You're
Right.
not going to have larvae. You're also not going to have smell. So
Okay.
when I was doing my commercial composting training
Mhm.
at the main school of compost many years ago, we went and did all these tours of these composting facilities, and this one composting facility was like so proud of this biofilter that they had. They're like, "Oh my god, it's like the biggest and best biofilter in the world." And you know what it was? Football
Mulch?
field of mulch.
Yeah.
It's just mulch. It really is.
Yeah.
Just mulch, you know. So it's like, and that surprises people, but it really is. You know, I've
Right.
composted dead chickens. I remember one of the farms we were based at before. One of the German shepherds went on a killing spree and killed like all these chickens.
Oh no.
Yeah, and like
Yeah.
the secret was 6 inches of mulch.
Yeah.
You know, for
Okay.
our final for our commercial composting certification, it was 300 cows need to be slaughtered because of mad cow disease. What do? The answer was 6 inches of mulch. You know,
Right.
of course you can do more than that, but like literally that that works.
Okay. So all of this leads me to the following question, which I think you and I have asked once and we were kind of like, I don't know, but why when it comes to like citywide garbage disposal have we not addressed this?
Many places in the world have,
Okay.
you
Yes,
know,
I do see it when I watch like my gardening shows on the BBC. It looks like they're addressing it like in England.
many like cities, states, counties, countries are
Hmm.
addressing it.
Okay.
Unfortunately, here in Miami, we are a little behind the times, or
Hmm.
maybe a lot behind the times. Actually, in 2022, the whole state of California went mandatory composting, and we have mandatory composting in many places. Like we've had it in San Francisco and Seattle for a long time. New York City has it. Austin, Texas, like the New England has like a lot of composting requirements, regulations, and stuff. There's food waste bans like all over the world. In some
Okay.
countries, like you're not allowed to put food in the landfill. Like they won't even take it. Other countries, they have a threshold. So if you're a commercial establishment that's producing more than a certain amount of food scraps per month or whatnot, then you're required to compost. Like they know, people know how big of an issue this is. Like,
Okay.
so this is not like news, you know?
No. Yeah.
Here in Miami, we are unfortunately pretty backwards. And it's an interesting situation because we had this waste energy facility that had a put or pay contract with the county. So it said basically that the county had to produce a certain tonnage of waste or the county paid for it anyway. So there was actually a disincentive to divert anything from the
Right.
landfill because we actually dipped below that. I think it was 1 million tons per year. We dipped below that a couple of times, like especially during like recession
Hmm.
periods. So even in the county code, like recycling is required. But go to any county building and see if they recycle. You know?
Right.
So I think that a lot of that had to do with that put or pay contract. And it's really interesting because last year the incinerator burned down. So right now we're actually exporting our waste to Georgia. How much sense does that make?
No.
Especially
Yeah.
when 60% of our waste stream is actually organic in nature. You know, 20 to 25% is food. But then when you add in the wood, the cardboard, the yard debris, the paper, it's 60%.
Right.
You know, so we can do a hella better. Like, because we're not doing things well here doesn't mean that the rest of the world isn't, though. Like, the rest of the world, you know, not maybe everybody, but they know what's up. I was just
Yeah.
in actually Bali this summer.
Mhm.
Rebin systems everywhere. You know, trash recycling, composting, trash recycling, composting. Like, it's everywhere. Like,
Right.
it's not rocket science either.
Yeah, it's not. And I do want to kind of plug that if you're at home and like, what can I do? You can. So the way I do it is I have one of those plastic hampers that had all the holes in it to begin with. Um, and I put it outside. That's what collects all like my kitchen scraps. And then it wasn't really my intention, but because it has the holes, I find worms in there all the time. So I know eventually you and I will get to worms and maybe we talk about it now, but one, the air gets in it, the water gets through it because it's a plastic hamper with holes. The only reason that you even need something is just to kind of keep your yard tidy rather than having like a mound. But if you didn't want to do a hamper, you don't even really have to do it. But it's a nice way of keeping everything nice and tidy so that when you're ready to go dump it in your raised bed, you can just kind of pick it up, go dump it and bring it back. But you barely need to do anything. You just dump it in there. I know some people turn it. To be honest, I don't even go through the effort of doing it, and it still ends up perfectly usable compost. So I will say that for anybody saying, okay, but Lanette does it commercially, what can I do? Like, just go get like a hamper and put it outside, and that should honestly be enough. So it's not like you were saying it, like it's not rocket science.
It's not. And there's so many different ways to do it. Like, when I first got into this,
Mhm.
I lived in South Beach. I didn't have
Okay.
a
Yeah.
backyard. I didn't have a balcony, you know, but I had room underneath my kitchen sink. So I ended up
Okay.
using worms, and worms, you know, ate all my food, and nobody knew unless I showed them.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
there was no smell, there were no flies, there was nothing. And then I remembered I measured it once, and I think it was in 3 months I collected 110 pounds of food, and I got 10 pounds of amazing worm castings from it, and it was all underneath my kitchen sink. You know, so there's many ways to do it. There's bokashi
Yeah.
systems, like, you know, buy systems if like they really don't, you know, feel comfortable making their own. It just really just comes down to, like, what does the person want? You know, does somebody want
Right.
something an easy way, and they just really don't, you know, care to use the compost? And there's certain ways to compost that are easier. You know, if somebody who really
Mhm.
wants to use the compost, you know, then there's more complicated ways. You know, you can go and do worm farming and things like that. So
Right.
it's the thing I find about composting. One of the things I really appreciate is that it's, in my opinion, empowering. Like, you don't have to wait for a company like me. You don't have to
Mhm.
wait for your municipality, your city, your state government, whatever, to set up a composting service for you. Like, you can do it yourself. You
Yeah.
know, it's not like recycling plastic. So, and
Yeah.
everybody can do it. So it's something like easy that every single one of us can do that actually makes a huge difference to our environment and to the world.
And as far as I can tell, at least in my experience to date, there are no downsides. You just go put it over there, and when it's ready, instead of having to go buy soil, like you were saying, for your raised beds, you just go and dump the compost in, and you've saved money, you saved time, you saved a little bit. And it's the best thing you can do, at least from a home gardener's perspective, it's the best thing you can do for your garden. So it makes life really easy.
Yeah. And there's some things, you know, to be aware of. Like, if you put on compost, if you're doing like a hot system and like the compost is too hot, you know, you don't
Yeah.
want to apply that to your plants yet, things
Yep.
like that. You're doing more of like a cold system, like you're not turning it. I don't think it's like a very big system. A lot of worms are in there. So
Mhm.
that's, you know, going to be super easy to apply to your garden pretty quickly. So yeah, I mean, there's a couple little things that people should be aware of. Like, if you don't want rats and smells and flies and things like that. But
Mhm.
it's super, super easy. I mean, like I said, it's like the secret is mulch and never
Yeah.
have them exposed.
Yeah. So let's segue into why you focus on composting with worms. So why specifically did you pick like that way of doing it?
So we actually have a bunch of ways that we compost. So composting
Okay.
with worms is just one of them. I got into the worms because, like I mentioned before, I lived in South Beach, and that's just the system that worked like the best for me.
Hmm.
I first started with bokashi, which is
Okay.
this anaerobic microorganism. And I would have to ask friends to dig up their backyard because after a certain period of time, like you needed to bury it. And so
Okay.
that got old. Like,
Yeah.
friends are like, what? You want to
Yeah.
dig up the yard again?
Yeah.
Uh, and then me lugging it and like a shovel and like it got old like
Right.
super, super fast. So that's why when I was doing my little research, I was like, oh, let me try worms. So, but some people do black soldier fly larvae,
Hmm.
and there's other methods. So, but the reason why I really, really like worms is that they produce probably what's known to be the most beneficial organic fertilizer on the planet. And
Hmm.
the worms are really catalysts. The worms create an environment where there is a massive amount of beneficial microorganisms, and that's the secret sauce. It's really the microbes. The microbes
Right.
are the ones that do the work. The microbes are the stars, of everything. So when people ask me like, "Oh, what do you do?" Blah blah blah, I can say a lot of things, but recently, what I've been saying the most is that I'm a microbe farmer because that's really what I am. I make the conditions to make microbes super happy and have lots of sex and like reproduce and break down this organic matter. And what's really cool about these microbes as well is that they're the ones that help the plants access nutrients. So there's a lot of nutrients in the ground, in the soil, but the plants cannot access it. So for instance, phosphorus in the soil, a plant cannot access that without having these symbiotic relationships with these microorganisms like mycorrhizae. So what a plant will do is when the plant needs nutrients, it'll actually send signals into the soil asking for what it needs. And then
Okay.
microorganisms respond. And the plant will give them sugars, so carbohydrates, sugars. And then the microorganism will give them nutrients. So phosphorus, they also fetch water. And these networks are vastly larger than a plant's roots. So even in a period of drought, trees survive. A lot of plants survive as long as there's this network there where these
Hmm.
microorganisms are actually fetching water for potentially like miles away or very, very deep into the earth to
Right.
supply to the plants. So it's
That's
it's
so
all
cool.
about the microbes. It really
Yes.
is.
That's what I've come to understand that compost when all these things break down, compost is very much alive and it has a lot of life flowing through it. So yeah, there's the organic matter that broke down, but really what it does is it houses life. And then that's why it's so effective when you fertilize your garden with it because you're doing exactly what you're talking about. You're providing all these microbes for your garden. And so that is what we would think of as fertilizer, like, oh, okay, I gave my plants all of this food and now the plants are doing better. And so that's why gardeners look to compost to make their garden nicer. So does that sound like a nice little wrap up of what
Yeah.
compost does?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I would say is that we don't give plants food. Plants make
Hmm.
their own food through
Hmm.
photosynthesis. So
Hmm.
they'll take, sunlight
Yeah.
and carbon dioxide and they'll make sugars and that's how they make their own food. So, but what they do need are those building blocks, you know? So ATP, the P stands for phosphorus, So they need these building blocks to survive, to live. So that's what we're really giving them are like the nutrients, those building blocks when we apply
Okay.
the compost.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's transition a little bit into seed starting. Because so the way Lanette and I met each other is last year I had this idea to do a seed starting series, which I did on my YouTube channel, and I was reaching out to different people just thinking about like what I could do and what I could feature while I was doing this. And Lanette came up, and so we connected at that time. And Lanette was nice enough to give me a bag of compost, and it worked like magic for the seed starting series. And so I think the reason that it works so well is because it was so fine, because it had gone through like this worm process. So it was very, very fine. Um, and I had not wanted it when I was preparing for that series, I had not wanted to buy seed starting mix because it contains peat moss, which I always understood was not a sustainable product when composting is. So can you talk to us a little bit about peat moss and like the different, maybe not, obviously they're different, but why you would use compost over peat moss, and why, like, what's the sustainability issue behind peat moss?
Yeah. So peat moss is a non-renewable resource. It takes millions of years to create these peat bogs that we, mine the peat moss from. So we actually like import here from Miami, like peat from Lithuania, from Canada. In Florida, we actually have some bogs too, but it's not a sustainable practice because we're mining it at a exponential rate where the planet can't replace it at the same rate. So why people like it is because it's actually a sterile medium. So it's devoid of life. And from there, they'll add, different things to it. But when you have a seed, so the seed already has energy in it. So the seed doesn't actually need like nutrients at the very, very beginning. So in most commercial establishments, like they, if you put fertilizer in it at that stage, you can actually burn the plant, the seed. It's just too much. Like the conventional fertilizers conventional fertilizers are salt, and it just will burn the plant. So a lot of times, like they'll just plant the seed in peat, but there's nothing to really help that plant. So that seed will sprout, and then hopefully it uses its energy, and then hopefully the gardener is quick enough to know, like, okay, the cotyledons are out, like, okay, now it's time to transplant, because if you don't, it'll wither and die, right? But on the other hand, if you're using something like worm castings or the compost, like a really, really like mature compost that has the microbes in it. And compost in general has very, very low like NPK. When you do a nutrient analysis, usually the NPK is like 111 or below. Conventional fertilizers, there's anything from 8, 20, 10 to 40, 20, 50. Like it's insane, like what they'll put in there. And you don't want that, like with the little seed, because like I said, it'll burn. But you definitely want the microbes, because the microbes are going to be fetching like nutrients to that seed, to that plant. So so that's why I think the seeds do a lot better in the compost or the castings than they do like in peat. And it's also renewable, to use compost and to use castings versus the peat. And the only thing too that I will say about that is that, so sometimes it's so rich in nutrients that the roots don't really need to grow out very far. Right. So it actually takes a long time. Like if you do it just in castings, it takes a while for the roots to actually grow out enough that you can pluck it out of the little cell tray and then repot it. So it's actually, in my opinion, even better to not use like 100% like castings or really mature compost. I like to mix it. So I'll usually mix it with 50% coconut coir. So coconut coir again, is basically an inert substance, but it's sustainable, renewable. We have plenty of coconut around, and then mix that with either compost or the castings, and then that will help the roots actually spread out a little bit earlier, and then you can pop it out and transplant it.
Oh, that's great advice. I'll try that this year. I think something that you mentioned that I would want to point out for anybody that wants to use compost for seed starting, as I have, is that it's really important that it be really fine. So I have spoken to some other people that have tried to use compost for seed starting, and if it is not broken down enough, if it's not mature enough, like Lanette was saying, it won't really work because the big chunks in compost, which is still good for a garden or a raised bed, but sometimes things haven't fully broken down and they're still a little bit chunky, that might prevent a seed from germinating. So if you're like, I strictly want to do this for seed starting, just consider that you might have to run it through like a strainer or something, which is doable. It just requires a little bit of time, like while you're prepping, to really get like the finest pieces of it and just like discard the chunky pieces, just to make this situation feasible, and so that you're not really like spinning your wheels on something that's not going to work. Because there is a way of making it work. You just have to put a little bit of time and effort into making that work.
Yeah, I mean that's a really important point. Like the compost needs to be like mature. It needs to be mature. Otherwise, you can burn like the roots. So just to explain really quick too, like when we do thermal composting, hot composting, the temperature actually goes from ambient temperature up to about 160 degrees, and then it will drop back down again. And when it gets into like the 80s, I like to see it in, it's in the curing phase, and you need it to cure. Like if you put a seed with compost that's not mature, so it's still too hot, like it will burn the plants. It will burn the seeds, and seeds are very delicate. So yes, absolutely. You need to make sure that compost is well broken down and mature.
Yeah. As much for the size as for the heat. So great point. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to discuss was one of the things that if you're in South Florida, you might know is that we've had a lot of issues with fertilizer and the runoff of fertilizer. And so there have been bans and so on and so forth. One of the things that's been obvious to me as somebody who enjoys gardening is if you feel that strongly about fertilizer, just replace it with compost. Like if you really feel the need to fertilize your garden, why not just replace it with compost? So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the fertilizer and what fertilizer does, and is like that's obvious to me, but I'm not saying it's necessarily right. Is compost like a good replacement for people who feel really strongly about fertilizing their gardens?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an amazing replacement. I mean, I think it works better, and it's a lot like easier to do.
Yeah.
So in grad school, I remember in my environmental nutrient management class, like where we had to calculate how much conventional fertilizer we were applying to pastures. We always had to calculate for a 40% runoff,
Okay.
because in conventional fertilizers,
Wow.
those nutrients are soluble. So
Hmm.
we knew that 40% off the bat was going to run off, and that's without a rain event. If there was a rain event, like up to 80% would run off. So
Okay.
because they need to make it soluble for the plants to be able to access it. Like basically eliminate that need for those microbes to make those nutrients accessible to the plant. So it's readily accessible, and then the plant doesn't really need to feed the microbes, and the microbes either move off or they die off.
Hmm.
So it's interesting too, because when I went away to grad school, this wasn't an issue, and when I came back, it was a huge issue that the bay was dying. I was like, "What is this? Like, why is everybody talking about the bay? What's wrong
Right.
with the bay? The seagrass
Yeah.
is dying. Like, why is the seagrass dying?" And I moved back in 2020, and that's when we had a big fish kill, like in the bay,
Hmm.
and that's what actually was the fire to finally enact a fertilizer ban over the rainy season. So
Hmm.
now during it might be May. I think it's May to November. We have a fertilizer ban, so we're not supposed to apply conventional fertilizers because it rains so much that we're washing away those nutrients into the water, and
Hmm.
that's what's causing all these algae blooms and the fish kills. We're basically these nutrients, they have to do something. They go somewhere, right? So the algae starts like going crazy and eating it up or whatever, and absorbing all of this oxygen that's in the water. And then there's no oxygen in the water for the rest of the animals. So the fish start dying,
Hmm.
and we get a fish kill. And unfortunately, one of the biggest culprits in terms of nutrient runoff are actually residents. So agriculture is a big component of it, but residents are too, because residents typically, I mean, the label's the law, in terms of like fertilizer, but how many people actually read the label. And
Yeah.
a lot of us think like, oh, more is better, more is better. So I know plenty of people that were like, oh, you know, they got their fertilizer and like, oh, it says apply 2 pounds, but I'll just apply the whole bag. I'll apply 10 or 5 or whatever. And they burn their entire lawn because there is such a thing as too much. Like you really do have to follow the labels. Like if you're going to use conventional fertilizer, follow the labels. You know, you're working with like a chemical, and this chemical can kill readily your plants. So residents should be super careful about that. And so the beauty of using compost is that you don't kill anything. You know, you mess up and you add too much, oh well, you know, it's not a problem, because the compost is not soluble. The nutrients in the compost are insoluble. So that means that it doesn't run off. It actually stays put. And that's why you need those microorganisms to make those nutrients available to the plant, right? So compost is absolutely a fantastic alternative. If you still want to keep your lawn like nice and green, like during the summer months, apply compost, apply castings. Yeah. We're actually going to be developing a turf blend, and we haven't talked about the tea, but the tea is amazing. You know, and it's
talk about it.
So the castings, like I mentioned, are probably the best known organic fertilizer on the planet. And from that, what we do is that we actually brew worm tea. So it's not for us to drink; it's for the plants. But we have these teas like Vortex brewers, and we put the worm castings in it, and we brew it for 24 hours. And we'll put other amendments in there too, like depending on what we're trying to do, because we actually have different recipes for different plants. And also, so fruit trees is different than turf, which is different than, you know, raised garden beds, etc. So we can actually develop teas that are actually specific to like a certain type of plant. And then in addition, the tea is amazing because not only is it a natural fertilizer, it also is a pest repellent. So we don't say pesticide because it doesn't technically kill anything. But if you think about it, in healthy systems, everything is in balance. So everything is in balance because there's something that controls something else. So something doesn't get out of control. So when you have a pest issue, it's because it got out of control. There's nothing keeping it in check. Right? So in the soil food web, you know, there's always a bacteria that controls a nematode that controls a fungi that controls the microorthopod that eats bacteria, etc. It's this whole web of life. And there's always like these incredible number of interactions happening where everything's kept in balance and check, right? So in conventional agriculture, we like to kill, right? So what we do is we add. Like we're adding like microorganisms. So that's what the tea does. Like the tea is, we're basically jump starting their reproduction. So we already have like a really nice amount of microbes that are in this castings and a really nice diversity. And when we inject it with oxygen, like the populations explode. So we apply that to the trees, and that will usually, there's something in the tea, a microbe in the tea that will balance out what's going on in the plant, you know?
Awesome.
So I can't tell you a lot of times what's happening. You know, I don't know, you know, sometimes I know, you know, we're doing these experiments with a root rot called Phytophthora, and we know streptomyces controls it, right? So we make sure that we add more, you know, that we have streptomyces in the tea, or trichoderma controls like many pests. So there's some things that we do know, but in general, I think we know very little about soil, and it's very, very akin to outer space or what's going on in the oceans. Like we have a very, very elementary understanding of what's going on. And I think you know, humans have like a lot to learn. So, but it doesn't really matter to us because the tea, there's something in there that controls what the issue is. So it's a pest repellent, and it also has naturally occurring phytohormones, so auxins and cytokinins and things like that, that actually promote fruiting and flowering. So that's the other really cool thing. Like if you have a fruit tree, for instance, that's never fruited or doesn't fruit very well, if you apply the tea before physiologically, like, you know, it's supposed to start fruiting, you should get fruit. You should get flowers. And even if it has been flowering, you're going to get more. So it's pretty crazy. And like, for instance, there's plants that are only supposed to flower once a year, like orchids, and you can get them to flower multiple times per year. You can get them
I'm sold. Orchids were the magic. Like if I can get, and my orchids do pretty well, but if you have a tea that gets my orchids to flower more than once a year, I'm sold.
Yeah, and what's also cool too is like things that are only supposed to flower certain times of year, you can actually get it to flower outside of that. Like Christmas
Mhm.
cactus can flower outside of Christmas. So it's a really, really, really amazing tool in the toolbox, and it's a really amazing way to apply it because when you're talking about applying castings or compost, that's a little labor, can be a little labor intensive.
Mhm.
But with the tea, it's super easy because it's a liquid. So we
Right.
apply it as a soil drench, but then we'll also apply it as a foliar application. We actually have trucks that will go out and spray it because we know that not everybody has like equipment to spray. And
Yeah.
or I mean, if you're doing it on a small scale, because you can do this in a 5-gallon bucket in your house,
Mhm.
and you can do something even easier that's called an extraction. And there you don't need a pump. And humans have been doing this for thousands of years. So these extractions, there's actually evidence that um, like 5,000 years ago, slaves would be churning the like a bucket with water and compost and churning it like
Mhm.
through the night, and that's all it is. It's like every once in a while you churn it,
Oh,
and
wow.
after 24 hours or it could be longer, you use that, and that's called an extraction, and that's um, beneficial too because you actually get a greater diversity of microbes, although
Mhm.
albeit at a smaller quantity. You know,
Okay.
so yeah, so the teas is just a great way to do everything. You know, to control pests, to increase yields because you're able to have more flowers, which produce more fruit, and it's a fertilizer. You know,
That's
lawns love
awesome.
it. Yeah, it's a if you know how to make it, it's pretty amazing stuff.
Yeah. And speaking of lawns, there was something that I wanted to talk about that I had forgotten until now. That, from what I understand, there's this like um, understanding that there's 6 inches of topsoil around the globe, and that's really where a lot of life, like that's where compost happens. That's where like where a lot of life is given to the plants that keep our ecosystem going. But that we've been depleting that because we haven't been allowing plants to compost the way it would have normally happened without human intervention. So is that, have I framed that correctly? Is that how you're thinking about it? Is that why we should all be composting?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we're eroding the soil faster than it's being created.
Hmm.
So think of like the Dust Bowl and what happened there, you know, and all the sediment too, all the soil is going into like the Mississippi River and it's going into our oceans, and that's not where we need it. We need it on the soil, you know.
Hmm.
So, and we're depleting our soils because, again, when we're using these conventional fertilizers, we don't need the microbes. The plants
Okay.
no longer need to use their sugars to feed the microbes because they're basically getting it kind of for free. So we have soil that's dead. And the soil provides so many different ecological benefits. Like the soil, so bacteria is like kind of gluey. You know, the body of a fungus is like a net, like the mycelium is a net. It holds things in place, right? And so in soils that are, it's really dirt is really was once soil, but it's now devoid of life, right? When you
Hmm.
have dirt, it's very easy for it to wash away. There's nothing holding it together anymore, you know? So all of
Okay.
this millions upon millions of years that we've taken to build up this soil ends up getting like washed away. So it's a huge issue. Like the way that we do agriculture now is not sustainable. You know, we
Okay.
can't keep doing it the way that we were doing it. And initially when we discovered that we could make these conventional fertilizers, there was a boost to agriculture. But over time, that boost has been declining. And now what do the farmers do? You know, like their soil is dead, it's devoid of life.
Hmm.
So we have to start regenerating our soils and getting them to support life again.
Absolutely. Okay. So tell us, where can people find you?
So we are at fertileearthwormfarm.com or Fertile Earth. Actually, we have a new website now, fertileearth.net. On
Okay.
Instagram, we are Fertile Earth. And we have a farm and homestead, specifically in the Redlands. We do tours. So we do tours of our farm and also our partner's farm, Lion Fruit Farm. And Lion Fruit is where we have our worm beds and we make the teas. And that's also a really cool farm because they do mushrooms and aquaculture and other things. So those are probably the easiest ways to find us. Just Instagram is, and we do have a YouTube channel that we haven't done much with, but we're going to start doing a lot more with. But we will be posting events and workshops very, very soon. We do have a newsletter, so if people want to sign up for that, they can do that online. And then if you want to see us and not go all the way to Homestead, we are at the Pinecrest Gardens Farmers Market on Sundays from 9 to 2. And if you don't want to go down the way to Homestead, but you do want to buy like products, we can always bring it to the market and people can pick it up there. We do have delivery, but
I said, oh, perfect.
Yeah, and we do have delivery, but delivery is usually for like larger amounts, like 5 yards.
Right.
But if you want a small amount, then the farmers market's a great place.
Yeah.
We are not bringing the tea or the worms there, but if you pre-order it, then we'll bring it the following week.
So if you're thinking about starting a vegetable garden, I would highly recommend making it out to the farmers market where Lanette is and getting, how big are the bags that you sell there?
Then we have the little tiny bags that are 2 pounds, or we have 10-pound bags, and we 25-pound bags.
Yeah, so you can go get your bags there and then have your seed starting mix ready to go because as we discussed, that's the stuff to get. So Lanette has it for you at the farmers market. So do that. Thank you so much, Lanette. This has been super informative and super helpful. And you can find all of Lanette's contact information that she mentioned down in the description box below. I'm also working on opening a Shopify store. So if you want to check that out, go ahead to the description box and you'll be able to find the latest information there. But thank you so much, Lanette. This was great.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. I hope I maybe inspire some people to think about composting.
Absolutely.